Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch. Very briefly, before we start the next panel, which is session 3, SEFs under Dodd-Frank, are they solving the problem? In line with the way that the process has gone this today, I'll run through Q3 of our first year in SEFs, which is actually Q2 in the real world. So what we had, I've been told just push the button, there we go. So I'll just bring these up. Q3 of SEFs, which is April to June this year, was really about two things. Yes, we had competition, we saw competition coming into the markets in the form of new SDRs, but the reality is Q3 was about cross-border issues and the failed attempt to get substituted compliance through the QMTF model between the European regulators and the CFTC. That didn't quite play out the way people expected, and as a result of that, you ended up with no one with a QMTF and one SEF registered outside of the US. And then the other big piece, which we're still dealing with, and I had no action relief the other day there on package transactions, but during April to June, we saw the introduction of MAT requirement in some areas of the package transaction mandate. So that was Q3. Because we didn't have enough to do at the time, that gave us a couple of things to focus on. And I think, for the most part, the SEFs that are here today and have worked diligently to provide services around those products as best they can, with a few little nuances still there in the form of void ab initio, but that's for another conversation, I guess. Without further ado, I will introduce the next panel, which will be moderated and hosted by Jeffrey Hogan, Managing Director of Business Development at BGC. And on the panel, we have James Colling, newly appointed CEO of BGC. Congratulations, James. Matthew Culkin, a friend of the WMBAA family at Squire Patton Boggs. Alex McDonald, a friend of mine, and also of the WMBAA family, is the CEO of the WMBAA in Europe. And last but no means least is Vince McGonigal, also a friend of the family, Vince, I think, as the Director of DMO at the CFTC. So on that note, I will pass over to Jeff and the panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We've carefully assembled the panel for you this afternoon. You've been able to scan the biographies of our participants and see their qualifications to speak with us this afternoon. However, there are some parts of their biographies which are not in the printed materials, which I'll share with you to highlight their some qualities to speak with us today. So I don't have to introduce Vince, but what you don't know about Vince is a first-generation American. He's the first member of his family to go to university. Therefore, as you might guess, he's the first lawyer in his family. But Vince has a very large family, not the least of which statistic I can share with you. He has 58 first cousins, and 40 of those are offshore. So Vince comes to us as an expert in both mediation and cross-border discussions. Now, Alex, what you don't know about Alex, he's a keen ocean sailor, and he's a mountaineer. And in 2005, he got within 1,000 meters of the summit of Everest. So as many of us think the rules have been just a big expedition, Alex brings with us the tools of managing such expeditions as we're climbing our own mountains to get the rules finalized. So James joins us in his history. He's ridden the motorcycle from Shanghai to London, so he's used to dealing with multiple obstacles along the way. And also his quirky, geeky hobby is he loves to toy with miniature motors, including small flying airplanes and mini drones. So he's been experimenting with drones, so he brings us expertise in surveillance. And what you don't know about Matt is on the morning of his wedding day, Matt and his wife insisted that 30 members of their immediate family join a 10K race, which is being run in the city in which they were married with many thousands of other people. So by forcing everyone in his wedding party to run 10K, Matt brings us skills in collaboration. So that's that's the group we have with us today. And based on the chairman's remarks of we shouldn't really discuss what the problem was, we'll leave that debate for another day, because we're not going to discuss the problems that we could be solving. We're going to try to discuss the rules, how the rules address the problems as they were perceived. But as the Commission discusses cost-benefit analysis, and it's the bedrock of all the rules, we can run a little cost-benefit analysis for us here today. And if you do the math, there were approximately 350 people who registered for the conference today. And I'll conservatively say that each of those persons has been working 40-hour weeks. We know that's not the actual number, but I'll be conservative, for the last 4 years. So if you add all that up, collectively, the people at this conference have spent 3 million hours working on the SEF rules. Unfortunately for Matt, those are not all billable hours. But it just shows that we've been working to solve the problems. We're not actually sure what the problems have been, but there's 3 million hours that we've spent to try to arrive at solutions. So the earlier panels this morning were more theoretical, more 30,000 feet, talking about high-level collaboration and high-level implementation of the rules. So we thought we'd get more granular this afternoon, especially with the markets that were made on the panel, 80-20 against collaboration, 80-20 against cross-border collaboration, to see if we can address some of the reasons why the market is currently skeptical and some of the reasons why that skepticism might be unfounded. So let me address Vince to kick off the conversation, to discuss the more practical approach of the DMO, and to talk about the process with which the DMO attempts to reconcile the high-level principle-based concerns that were outlined in the statute and the actual technology-neutral terms that the statute has laid upon all of us, with looking forward the practicalities of the work that's not done, the challenges we still face us, and first, today on November 12th, looking forward, Vince, what are the most urgent challenges the DMO has to carry us forward in the rule set?
Okay, so, and this is on? Yeah, all right. So I think that those questions would probably carry us right to the end of this panel and through the next. I will get into some detail about what DMO is looking at currently, say the challenges or opportunities that we have. The business and the regulatory side of the house is how I think of things, not the enforcement side. So for business, market growth; for regulatory, the continuing compliance review that we're doing within DMO, and technology affects both. So for market growth, we've been evaluating and looking at where is the unification of the trading as a byproduct rather than by participant, and what's the rationale for the separation that we see, and is it a separation that requires further input, guidance, direction from the Division of Market Oversight. The chairman referenced this morning that we would be looking at issues including, for example, the anonymity question and the name give up, and we are looking at what are the circumstances surrounding which a trade that begins its life cycle as being anonymous and is required at the end of the day to be reported anonymous and has overlapping obligations directed towards swap dealers not to enter into any agreement that would require the name give up of a counterparty, that we're having a conversation a year into trading about whether an anonymous trade should maintain anonymity. So we're going to continue to look at this, and we're going to ask questions of the CEFs and market participants, hopefully to the extent that this is an old business practice that was necessary for credit and is no longer needed, that it will quickly go away. We're also continuing to focus on reflection. We're a year in. We've seen rules that have been implemented by the CEFs, and our obligation is to go back and to see how those rules are working. And so while we're always progressing forward, we do want to step back and have a look. Our markets are supposed to be a competitive, open and competitive marketplace, and so we look at questions concerning, for example, how trades are brought into the CEF. Is the CEF just a reporting vehicle, or is the CEF actually an execution facility? And so we'll be evaluating those rules associated with execution styles to ensure that we're doing with what we're intended, which is to bring open competition to these facilities. On the continuing compliance review, a few things that we're looking at are recognizing that the SEFs should be and are innovative with respect to the trading opportunities that they bring to market participants. There are baseline regulatory obligations that all of the SEFs must comply. So we have been working very diligently through our rule permanent registration process involved in issue identification, so that when we spot something that we think is broader SEF application from the review we're currently doing, that we have the facility and flexibility to carry that message out to other market participants. So we'll be looking for consistency in the SEF rulebooks. And a horizon issue is the role of the Chief Compliance Officer at SEFs. We're focused on seeing a year in, what is the Chief Compliance Officer's responsibilities, how are they discharging those responsibilities within the facility, and how are they managing potential conflicts of interest. So that'll be a discussion I think we'll see in the coming months. And then on technology, a few areas. There have been some conversations, and the chairman referenced this morning, straight through processing or affirmation process. And so we've been communicating with our sister division, the Division of Clearing and Risk, concerning the market's ability to move to direct electronic reporting for the routing of trades post-execution. And we're going to continue those discussions. And finally, our system safeguards. These markets work when they have system safeguard integrity. And we have our compliance team has been going through the SEFs, conducting those reviews, and we're going to proceed with that in the coming months.
So Matt, based on that update from Vince, from a legal perspective going forward, do you think any of the objectives of DMO can be challenged or thwarted, in fact, by legal challenges to any of the rules as we see the new, not only just the new midterm election impact, or just general challenges to the rules themselves?
Thanks, Jeffrey. First, I'd say that legal challenges in terms of litigation are a bit of a trickier task right now. For those of you who had to go through law school, you might remember the Chevron doctrine that gives agencies a fair amount of discretion as they're implementing law. And so it could come down to what judge you get. It could come down to how you argue the case, whether it's cost-benefit analysis or substantive interpretation of law. But that's it's a significant investment with an uncertain reward. You mentioned midterm elections. There's probably a better chance that certain provisions of Dodd-Frank will now get a serious shot at being tweaked. The one that comes to mind is not a SEF rule, but in the swap data repository space, there's a provision that requires foreign entities to indemnify the SDR for the information that they're receiving. And just as a practical matter, those foreign entities aren't in the business of indemnifying. For example, a foreign government might not indemnify a private company based in the United States. There were a series of bills that went through the House, this current Congress that's about to go out, with overwhelming bipartisan support. So you'll probably see those move forward next Congress, and maybe as some of these SEF issues get worked out, they too become part of a Dodd-Frank technical corrections bill. And for example, there's a core principle that SEFs have to monitor position limit violations. Well, it's really hard if there are 24 SEFs for any one platform to know that a large trade on its platform is a position limit violation, because at the same time that counterparty might be long on its platform and short on another. So that's the type of thing that would be ripe for review because of just the impractical nature of it. I would say, though, after hearing Vince's really interesting list, that the longer the SEF registration process goes on, the more issues seem to pop up. It's a little bit of like playing whack-a-mole, where 6 months ago we were worried about DMO questionnaires related to Part 43 and Part 45 reporting capabilities of the SEFs. The last few months have been focused looking at position limit compliance functions or voice audit trail capabilities, and I'm going to go home today and now revisit the CCO provisions, because that seems to maybe be one of the next things that we need to advise clients on. So the chairman seems to want to push registration forward. Some of the temporary registrations will soon start to expire. I think the first is in August of 2015. And so at a certain point, market participants are going to want to see permanent registration so that they can start to carry out the onboarding process and select the liquidity providers they want to use.
So James, based on that comment and Vince's reference to collaboration with SEFs, I mean, in your experience, do you think the SEF registration process will change tone now that we have a smaller number of months for those registration decisions to be made? And how do you think the collaboration that the SEFs represented here today have had with DMO will impact the continuing negotiations to check off the list that Vince mentioned prior to the expiration of the temporary licenses?
Hey, that's quite a mouthful. So, with regard to the rules, what Vince is talking about, it sounds as if there's tweaks really to some of the rules. And you talk about, Matt talks about technical correction bills within Congress. I don't know if they get through, but I think one of the things is for SEFs is, for the most part, the rules are here to stay. And we all have businesses to run, and I think it's important that when I look out across this room, certainly our businesses are probably going to evolve a lot faster than some of these rules are, and that you can already see them by walking through the halls out here. I see numerous fully functional order books and RFQ systems. Working with regulators, that's been a fairly open to a process historically. I would expect it to continue. I think both sides should manage their own expectations, and each other's expectations as we sort of fix some of these things. I wanted to touch, though, on one of the things that Vince, you mentioned that I have a question on, and that is trade anonymity. I'll play devil's advocate, but is it in the Dodd-Frank Act that you have to have an anonymous trade?
So where's Scott O'Malley? run the Q&A. So a question surrounding trade anonymity that we are looking at is how it interacts with impartial access. And so, if there is a position that's put up that you're trading anonymously, and you don't have to, right? You have the RFQ, and there's fully disclosed trading platforms as well. And so you do see an expectation by the market participants when a trade starts anonymously that it end anonymously, as well as the regulator. I went out earlier this year with an interim final rule, for example, on maintaining the confidentiality of counterparty information at the time you get to the reporting stage. So there is a little bit of a head scratcher for there seems to be significant market interest in trading anonymously, and the ability, concerns, say from a year ago, around enablement provisions, and we worked hard with the market to address those issues, to ensure that folks can come to the market and participate in a way that allows for the price discovery process, which also doesn't necessarily have to include who am I doing this deal with.
I think James raises a good question, because the CEA historically was a principles-based regime where at the time DCMs or other regulated entities had the ability to construct a rule set sort of that worked for them, but also was consistent with the statute and the CFTC's rules, and something like name give up at execution might be an example of places where the CFTC has become increasingly prescriptive, And in part because they've asked for, market participants have asked for more certainty. The exchange regulatory model wasn't fully baked in 1 year, which is where we are now. And so sometimes more certainty is being requested by market participants, and the regulators trying to accommodate that and provide direction. But the flip side of that is other folks see that as being prescriptive and dictating market structure.
So Alex, this morning there were some carefully worded diplomatic answers to address the failure of the QMTF. And based on your experience with regulators across Europe, do you feel that the failure of the QMTF combined with the unpredictability of relief and guidance has caused a schism to exist between Europe and the US from a practical perspective that will mean the 80-20 markets that people made this morning were actually more positive than is the reality?
That's right. From where we have been this year, the 80-20 prediction is a positive reaction from a 100-0 position. And what really happened, perhaps, in that period, trying to get QMTF operational, was that in the period to which no one could agree, the market itself had offshored to Europe for a lot of its global and wholesale derivatives business. So by the point to which the details of the problems became narrowed down and clear, which was that certainly the WMBAA members could not see the attraction, and this did come up this morning, business-wise, of running a different liquidity pool for QMTF liquidity as opposed to MTF or non-MTF liquidity. Their major client set had already offshored, and the problem itself had gone away. Certainly in terms of it being a problem against business. So, yes, it's been an ongoing issue of the minutiae of how do you arrange a fungible liquidity pool based on the location of your counterparties, particularly given that liquidity pool is going to be split between cleared and non-cleared, and the cleared portion split between the different clearing houses again, and so on and so forth. Given that situation, 80-20 seemed a better place than where we are at the moment.
And Vince, to pick up on a few remarks the chairman made this morning regarding the limitations outlined by resource issues, can the market look forward to, and the CEFs look forward to, more relief extensions? And is the timing of the rule implementations themselves a concession in some ways internally at DMO to the resource allocation issues that the chairman outlined?
Right. Okay. So my neighbor here reminded me that I had been at the top of my page to start with the disclaimer. So up until now, it's sort of all been a dream. It's my opinions alone, statements that I've made, and do not represent those of the division, the commission, or my extended family, as we talked about earlier. So with respect to resources, what we do and what we've always done is we manage priorities, and that's our focus is to evaluate where we can get the most benefit from the actions that we take, and that does come in all shapes and sizes. Thinking about no action relief, my primary goal is to implement the regulations in furtherance of the Commodity Exchange Act as enacted. The no action relief has grown to be a part of the process, and we've utilized it, particularly using the example of the MAT, to stage into implementation, not to keep people away from the requirements, but it is a way to get folks to work on the requirements. But even doing something like the recent relief that we did on the packages required extensive communications with industry. We had 2-3 staff who participated in dozens of calls going back a period of months to see where the market was in terms of readiness, and also meet the standard I was laying down about the MAT obligation by the Commission required to be traded on the facility, a message that I was also carrying out to industry. And I think what we saw is that the industry came back, and there's, say, some validation of feelings and understanding that the Commission following enactment of Dodd-Frank has changed the way these transactions are supposed to be traded. And so how do we get to that next level? And we received very good substantive comments about how to do that. But there was a lot of resources involved in just getting that package piece out. So while I'm working on that piece, it does affect our ability to do other things. And, you know, SEF registration, for example, the pace that we would like to be at if you were just in a box checking world would move along a lot more quickly. But we've seen, and we've talked a little bit about issues like position limits, position accountability, audit trail. Those conversations, in order to meet the mandate, have required some flexibility in the discussion surrounding the method. And those discussions involve, you know, getting direction from within the building, thinking about the facts that we need from outside of the building, not this building, and communicating those issues in a way that makes clear where we're going, and that I can inform our client, my client, the commission, about why we're taking the steps we are and the timing that we're taking them.
James, both the panels this morning referred to the relatively slow or lack of change at all in the behavior of customers as the rules are congealing. In your experience, in your conversations with customers, are they saying to you that they're looking for a certain series of events to occur before they change their behavior, or behavioral changes, which could be argued as one of the objectives of the rules, is not actually in play?
It's interesting because I think we need to put everything in perspective. We talk of 4 years, we talk of the Dodd-Frank Act, we talk of the rule-making process, the roundtables, the comment letters, and SEFs going live really only a year ago. There's a very high expectation that customer, whether it be buy-side or sell-side behavior, is going to change on a dime. I think in certain ways that's somewhat unrealistic and contrary to human behavior. I think it's there's much more sort of content. It's less revolutionary and more evolutionary, I think. We've certainly had, in my conversations, there's a certain, people are trying to run a business. So there's a certain expectation of SEFs as to, if you're going to do business on a SEF, that there's certain boxes that can be checked. Can you process a trade? Do you have the right technology? Do you have the right resources to deploy? Are you approaching me the right way I should be approached as an end user, as a dealer or as a customer, if you want to see my business? And again, I make reference to the holes outside those doors. It's definitely a competitive marketplace. So I would say behavior is, it's changing, but it's a bit of a show me as well. Show me what you got. And I don't think it's ultimately going to be one, and if it were that easy that you could just show up with some technology and plug in, well and good. But I think it's a lot more complex, multifaceted than that. Companies have their own personalities. Companies have their own, their needs. And I think it's certainly something where it's not just about putting a tight two-way price on a live screen. I think it's going to be, and already is proving to be, a challenge where you integrate on a post-trade, on a pre-trade, and some of this stuff came up as we started to go post-MAT or even pre-MAT in terms of pre-trade allocations, post-trade allocations, pre-trade credit checks. All this stuff started to come out where we, I think as an industry, started to think, oh, we didn't think about that. Well, what's the solution? So it's certainly been a very, I think collectively we've been a quick study in terms of meeting the rules that the CFTC have promulgated. But also we have to remember that we have to address and be consistent in addressing the needs of our clients. And they're evolving over time. Sometimes you go in and you speak to a customer and they can't yet even orchestrate or pronounce some of the words, the diction. We're all learning new words. These are words that a lexicon that is well used in other asset classes. It's new for us. We're OTC. So I think behavior will change, and the trick with behavior, I think, is collectively for a marketplace to adopt something and not know that they're adopting it. Why? Because it fits just right with their core business. Oh, I like that, so I'm going to use it. And you know what? It's really easy to use. Whether it be an iPhone that, hands up who has a BlackBerry still. I mean, or the internet or anything else. Of course, about half of you guys probably do have BlackBerries. 2001 is calling, they want their BlackBerries back. The point is you've got an evolutionary change that's going on. It's been crammed into a very short period of time. And ultimately, I think behavior is changing. There's a little bit of show me on both sides, but also it's going to require, I think, from the SEF standpoint, if I can, certainly from where I sit, consistency, a lot more resources, and a lot more time.
So Alex, given the fact that people's behavior is changing at a semi-glacial pace, and that, to pick up on Scott's reference to 2017 when MiFID kicks in, I mean, are you having conversations with regulators in Europe discussing specifically the impact of the inevitable gaps, not only in the timing but the content of the rules, and whether that'll impact potentially what the CFTC does in terms of how they roll out the rule set?
I mean, absolutely. As Edwin mentioned this morning, it has occupied both the FCA and the Commission in Brussels plus ESMA in Paris, increasingly over the I guess the last year, since they've noticed that much of the derivatives business has been offshoring to the EU. The gaps aren't only in timing. There's a lot of process gaps as well, which is why you hear so much reference to outcomes and reporting and certainly the repository process, as much as saying, oh, let's just wait to 2017 and it'll be fine. I mean, the first point I would make is that the difficulties at every step of a bilateral substituted compliance recognition regime have been so big that when you actually turn that into a multi matrix of 25 jurisdictions by 25 jurisdictions, and that those problems are therefore exponentially increased, it becomes a lot harder, and you've got to look for some sort of formal framework, presumably under IOSCO. It could be under these other regulatory forums or the ODRG or so on and so forth, but I think the regulators need to choose any one, and understand that matrix is a lot harder at all the countries times all the countries rather than one by one at the moment, and only one set of rules. That said, we also note that in Europe there is much emphasis placed, as we point out, on the role of the compliance officer and the role of the board and board governance and so on, and certainly the WMBAA firms, when they've rolled out SEFs, have been quite surprised that there hasn't been a bigger rule book for board governance and the role of the board and the interaction of the board and the chief compliance officer in a way which they have to do in their day-to-day business in the EU in running MTFs or IDBs generally, where the interaction between the business risks, the operational risks, and the board are monitored by the regulator with forensic closeness. And certainly that's one point I would make about a gap that's less often spoken about in the media than others. But certainly issues such as there is no concept of RFQ or CLOB offering one or both in certain ways under MTF, OTF rulebooks, and indeed the methods are not allayed to in the level 2 work which the Commission has given to ESMA in this period from really the start of last year, the start of this year now, until 2017, but rather there will be a transparency framework and the methods of execution, be they RFQ, be it more traditional voice broking, hybrid broking, auctions, etc., are going to be subject to the governance rules laid down and the transparency rules laid down, but no prescriptive layout of how pre-trade transparency needs to be set out, and indeed pre-trade transparency can be indicative. And this, again, I mean, my last quick point, coming back to the name give up point, is in the EU, because certainly the MiFID rules are all financial instruments, and therefore particularly the money markets and the bond markets. This plethora of trading that goes on where you link one to the other in what people call packaged products or some sort of combination has to be dealt with as a whole in the EU, and it's certainly raising all sorts of issues around how you indicate where that package may be beforehand, how you can then prove best execution to where that package might have been quoted by a different venue, if that venue is a multi-to-multi venue or the systemic internalizer of a different bank or whatever. These issues are actually becoming very, very hard in terms of proving how a package can be executed in one, or can execution happen several times over for the same thing, i.e. the package is executed but the legs are executed differently, and actually execution happens not only on the one arranging venue but also on the legs, be that on an MTF or an RM or a DCM in the US or so on and so forth. So there are gaps aplenty, and I don't know, I could be here all day going on to other gaps, but the two I'd point out are packaged products and board governance.
Did you have a comment on that, Matt?
Yeah. I wanted to go back to something James said a minute ago when we were talking about the commercial dynamics that go into client behavior. I wouldn't underestimate the role of regulatory uncertainty. To date this year, the CFTC has put out 137 different no-action letters or interpretive guidances. And someone pointed out this morning that some of them are time-limited, but you don't really know until the day before it is set to expire whether or not it will be renewed. Some of the others aren't time-limited, and so you don't know when that might be revoked. And it makes it really hard for market participants, whether it's a customer on a SEF or the SEF itself. It's hard to plan the business if you're not sure what's going to come out that next Friday at 6 p.m. when the CFTC seems to try and ruin my Friday night and put out some tortured document. But it plays an important role in the marketplace generally, and until the rules sort of quiet down and the dust settles, these are important issues that continue to pop up and make it hard for folks to project out.
So throwing the gauntlet down to Vince there, I know the market appreciated the relief on packages coming out, a reasonably long period prior to the expiration. And is that a sign that the market can expect the DMO to be more anticipatory than things coming out at the 11th hour?
So it's not all about Matt, what Matt's Friday schedule is. But right, we've had a concentrated focus, and it's just not at the division level. It's all the way up through the commission to the chairman's office to be aware of deadlines that are coming up, as well as when we put out relief. We did the package relief earlier this year. We tried to go out as early as we could before the May 15th date. Sometimes the information isn't coming in till late. A few weeks ago, I had our staffers on the phone and was asking associations, hey, we know you want to come in with a request. We really need to see it because we want to make this decision. But we are thinking about that. We are trying to be forward-leaning on those dates that are going to expire versus those dates where we're looking at them as horizon to make further determination. So, for example, the package relief has language in there that's talking about collecting data and information, because a year out for some of those, a year after February, the time period will roll off, but coming into that date, we'll have a sense of where the market is, and we want to be proactive in terms of the next step, and maybe the next step is letting it roll off. Fingers crossed that's where we get. But we certainly want to be proactive in that process. On the regulatory ambiguity, there's a question on the international space. I mean, CFTC was the first to reach across the aisle to talk about what to do and engage Europe on this QMTEF proposal. And that is, we have a significant responsibility under 2I with respect to risk that impacts U.S. institutions, and make sure that that is protected. And so sending it all offshore doesn't feel like the right thing to do. And so, we had to balance what Congress wanted us to do versus this tension between those on the other side of oceans or wherever that don't currently have their rules in place and need to develop their rules. And so currently that's a nice place for market participants to be who want to be OTC, but as regulatory ambiguity starts to grow in these other countries as they develop their proposals, I wonder whether the rules that we have and the mechanism that we've put forward in this past year will get momentum, because it will be a tried and true product, certainly by 2017.
And just to jump in there, I mean, a couple of the other areas that we've been in long discussions with for several years now with the CFTC, with DMO staff, are areas around anti-money laundering rules, qualifications, and other areas where if you want to trade between one jurisdiction and another, you need some form of deference. And these things run deep. It's getting, you know, I think money laundering and so forth are going to be big issues over the next 2 years at every international agenda. And trying to ask we asked the CFTC if they can defer to the money laundering rules in Europe, and they say, well, it's not really us, it's the State Department, it's Treasury, and how can we change that? And in terms of the rules, so they say, well, it's not really us, it's the NFA, or it's this or it's that. How can we recognize your professionalism? And it's not only just sort of trade execution rules or clearing or recognizing, you know, ICE US versus ICE Futures Europe or whatever as being the same. It runs deep at every level to try and get this working properly as a cross-border process once you've got a prescriptive rule set in there. Again, I note a couple of quotes. Bart Chilton, when I met with him earlier this year over in London, said, well, we always worked on a basis of if we build it, they will come. And I noted that the language now, the mood music from the chairman is now, if the market builds it in a way the market likes, they will come. Because he said, well, we built it, and they all went away. And I think that was a wrong mantra. So I think the mantra is now that the market needs to build it in a way in which they have confidence in the liquidity that comes out of it. And the other point I was going to say is another staffer who worked on Capitol Hill under the writing the Dodd-Frank rules said, well, we built it with no locational requirements because we understood on Capitol Hill that the dollar was the balance sheet denominator for banks around the globe for their capital and their capital adequacy and the Basel requirements, and so we couldn't put a location requirement on it. And that location requirement came in after the initial aspirations of Congress as well, which are the bits which have formed, or some of the bits which have formed these barriers to trading US, non-US product. I would say that the EU's got all of its own problems too, which are mainly around putting some sort of trade barrier around the EU, which has always had. So it's no better in Europe, it's just different.
So Vince, going back to your original list of the work ahead of us, you have the CEF community in front of you in a time where the sands are going through the hourglass and there's a lot to do. What would be your advice or wish list? You know, we've had intensive collaboration with the WMBAA, but looking forward, are there things that the WMBAA and its members could be doing more effectively with DMO to accelerate the timetable and assist you, for example, to come out with relief earlier rather than later? And what would be your professorial advice to us as an industry to assist you and your colleagues to get the job done?
Yikes, I don't know if I can go that far, but I can talk just more practically. And in the number of issues that we've talked about today, just a reference here at the table, I mean, we've identified, we feel, a comprehensive list of areas that we need to get through as this market grows into a self-regulatory environment. And so I feel that the registration process has been effective in identifying those issues, and some of these things we need to get to resolution on. So your client's participation on those discussions to get rounded out on some of the registration issues, I think would be helpful, because once we get through this first chunk, I'm cautiously optimistic that we will be able to execute the permanent registrations as a group pretty quickly thereafter. And so I feel that there are things, this is a regulatory environment, we're going to go back and revisit. I think that's always the case. You need to do that. Continued integration of the data we haven't spoken about, that needs to happen. Some things I think we're going to see-ish, I don't know when, but relatively, it's on the horizon for me. Swaps block determination. What are the swaps blocks levels? Swap blocks levels. So we need to get that out. Part 37 refresh. So the road has been built, as the chairman mentioned today, and so we're going to be interested in evaluating what changes we can make that facilitate these transactions. And so that's something that's on the near-term agenda for us, and I'm sure we're going to be hearing from market participants on what, there may be some discussion about what a tweak is. But if you have an issue, let us know. I can't help. I can't get engaged unless I'm informed. And so it's important for me to make sure that I have the facts. If we know that we need to reach out, we'll of course reach out. But if you think we're missing something, you know where to find DMO. We're on the 2nd and 3rd floor in Washington, D.C. People take the elevator up every day.
Not another elevator speech, please. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me invite the audience to pose questions to our panelists, if anyone would wish to do so. I'm not seeing any hands go up, so let me thank our panelists for joining us today and for your attention. Thank you very much.